Hello, I'm Joe Follansbee. This is the first of two videos on the 6 rules of putting climate change into your fiction. I'm the author of the science fiction series Tales from a Warming Planet. The first full-length novel is called Carbon Run. Check out the links in the caption. I find that many writers, especially new writers, crave rules that will lead to success in the marketplace. I'm not so sure those rules exist, but if you're interested in writing in the new subgenre of climate fiction, I've come up with a few boundaries that might help you in your role as a storyteller. Rule 1. Climate change is the driving force behind the narrative. The impact of long-term change in the Earth's climate is the single most important factor distinguishing climate fiction from other genres. Put another way, the absence of long-term climate trends in a narrative about climate change would render an otherwise well-constructed story meaningless at best. If you're a little confused about the whole climate change thing, you're not alone. It helps to remember the difference between weather and climate. For example, weather happens over a short period of time. Climate happens over a long period of time, meaning decades or centuries. Stories that depend on a specific weather event, such as a tornado or a hurricane, do not qualify as climate change. But there's an exception, the narrative that makes clear that the weather event is closely tied to long-term climate change. For example, the story of Noah's Ark is not climate fiction, because the biblical flood was a single, one-time, divinely caused disaster, not the result of a long-term climate trend. Rule 2. Understanding climate change within the story depends on science. Climate fiction is science fiction. Many writers think of cli-fi, as some call it, as a subgenre of sci-fi. Climate fiction works best when the change driving the narrative is based on established science, or at least speculation that stems from science. A writer could base a climate fiction novel or short story on the scientific consensus or on a minority viewpoint. But facts derived via the scientific method are key. A story that posits an impossible effect of climate change is not climate fiction. For example, the 2013 schlock motion picture Sharknado linked a weather event spawning flying sharks to climate change. This is patently impossible, and therefore Sharknado is not climate fiction. Rule 3. Climate fiction happens on Earth, mostly. From a scientific perspective, climate happens on any celestial body with an atmosphere. Mars, for example, has a climate just like Earth. Theoretically, a writer could set a climate fiction story on a distant world facing a climate disaster, or in the case of Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy, an upgrade. But a hallmark of most cli-fi stories is the impact of climate change on a near-future human society. And we only know of one such society, Earth. Unless the writer needs to place her climate change story on a non-Earth world, it's probably best to make our home world the setting. There you go. Those are the first 3 rules of climate change fiction. In my next video, I'll go over the last 3 rules. Hello, I'm Joe Follansbee. This is the second of 2 videos on the 6 rules of writing climate change into your fiction. I'm the author of the science fiction series Tales from a Warming Planet. The first full-length novel in that series is called Carbon Run. Check out the links in the caption. You learned in the previous video about the first 3 rules. You might want to check that video out before watching this one. In this video, I'll talk about the final 3 rules. Actually, they're not so much rules as best practices or guidelines, but I still think they're useful. Rule 4. Writers do not have to label work as climate fiction for it to qualify as such. The term climate fiction goes back to 2008, when activist and public relations man Dan Bloom first suggested it. He saw it as a way to classify certain climate-based stories. Several dozen books and movies have received the label. Some reviewers have even said that George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones is a climate change story because of the invasion from the north. Of course, writers working before 2008 would not have used the term. For example, one of the earliest identified climate fiction novels, The Drowned World by J.G. Ballard, was published in 1962. These days, the term is not widely accepted in the literary community, so writers probably shouldn't use it when pitching new work to agents or publishers. Maybe someday. Rule 5. Keep your political views on climate change to yourself. The history of literature is filled with authors who change public policy with exceptionally crafted fiction. Charles Dickens highlighted the poverty of mid-19th century London in Oliver Twist and other novels. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle exposed conditions in early 20th century meatpacking plants. But most authors avoid this approach because it's very difficult to do without appearing preachy or dogmatic. Climate change is so politicized that you can't even mention it in some circles without being called either a wacko lefty or an ignorant denialist. Just stick with writing a good story with compelling characters in a climate context. Rule 6. Like all other fiction, climate fiction has no rules. I know I've produced 2 videos telling you that there are 6 rules for climate fiction. But experienced writers will tell you that fiction has no rules for success, though various guidelines or best practices are useful. Climate fiction is no different. For example, 95% or more of climate fiction is dystopian. Cli-fi usually assumes that climate change is detrimental to human societies, often wiping out civilization as we know it. But at least one novel recently, The World We Made by Jonathan Porritt, presents a utopian view. In his book, societies thrive and the environment is saved. In other words, fiction rules are made to be broken. But if you break the rules, be smart about it. There you go. You've learned about 6 rules for putting climate change into your novels, your short stories, maybe your screenplays or even stage plays. The important thing is to keep writing about climate change. It's now an important part of everyone's life. Questions are welcome. Thanks for watching.